Margaret Hayes adjusted her white cap as she entered room 247 at Millfield General Hospital. The morning light filtered through Venetian blinds, casting soft patterns across the linoleum floor. Her rubber-soled shoes made barely a whisper as she approached the bed where her newest patient lay propped against white pillows. Thomas Blake, age 35, according to his chart, found unconscious near the old railway bridge 3 days ago by a jogger who'd spotted his crumpled form in the tall grass. No identification, no wallet, no clues about his life before that moment. The bandage wrapped around his dark hair was clean and white against his pale skin, but his eyes, when they opened to look at her, held a clarity that seemed at odds with his supposed condition. "Good morning," Margaret said softly, checking his chart with practiced efficiency. "How are you feeling today?" Thomas's dark eyes met hers with what appeared to be genuine confusion. "Better, I think. The headaches are less severe." His voice carried a slight hesitation, as if each word required careful consideration. "I'm sorry, but could you remind me, what's your name?" "Margaret Hayes." "I'm your nurse." She set the chart aside and reached for his wrist to check his pulse. His skin was warm, his heartbeat steady and strong. "Do you remember anything else? Even small details might help." He shook his head slowly, wincing slightly at the movement. "It's all blank, like trying to look through fog." Margaret made notes on his chart, but something about his response nagged at her. There was an intensity in his gaze when he thought. She wasn't looking, a watchfulness that seemed inconsistent with memory loss. Still, head injuries were unpredictable. She'd seen patients recover fragments gradually, others whose memories returned in sudden, overwhelming floods. What Margaret didn't know was that Thomas Blake remembered everything with perfect clarity. Every detail of his investigation into the money laundering operation running through Millfield's community bank, every face in the photographs hidden in his jacket pocket, every conversation he'd recorded, every transaction he'd traced, every connection he'd mapped between the seemingly innocent small town and a sophisticated criminal network. He remembered the moment his cover had been blown, the screech of tires on the bridge road, the impact that had sent him tumbling into darkness. Most of all, he remembered the very real attempt on his life, and his growing certainty that someone in this hospital was involved in the conspiracy he'd spent 6 months unraveling. The Amnesia story was his lifeline, bought him time while he figured out who could be trusted and who might be planning to finish what they'd started on the bridge. But as Margaret moved around his room with quiet competence, checking his IV, adjusting his pillows, Thomas found himself facing an unexpected complication. There was something about her gentle manner, the way she listened when he spoke, that made him want to trust her. And that was dangerous for both of them. "Your father called again this morning," Margaret mentioned as she updated his medication chart. "Mr. Hayes from the dairy farm outside town. He's been asking when you might be discharged." Thomas looked puzzled. "My father? Oh, I'm sorry, that's my father. Sometimes I get distracted." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "He's been in and out of the hospital lately, heart problems. I suppose I have families on my mind." She didn't mention the mounting medical bills, or how her ex-husband Robert had made it clear during their divorce that she'd be facing those expenses alone. Some burdens were too personal to share with patients, even ones who seemed to invite confidence with their quiet attention. Their first real conversation happened during evening rounds. The hospital grew quieter after dinner, and Margaret found herself staying longer in room 247 than strictly necessary. Thomas had been reading, or pretending to read, a novel she'd brought from the hospital library. "Tell me about Millfield," he said, setting the book aside. "Maybe hearing about the town will help something come back." Margaret pulled a chair beside his bed, settling into it with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent years on her feet. "It's not much to tell, really. Population just under 3,000. Main Street has a diner, a bank, 2 churches, and too many people with nothing better to do than talk about their neighbors. You sound like you speak from experience. Small towns have long memories. Her voice carried a note of weariness that made Thomas look up from his hands. Sometimes that's comforting. Sometimes it's suffocating. Bad memories. Margaret was quiet for a moment, studying his face. There was something about this man that made her want to open up, to share the disappointment she'd kept locked away. Since her divorce, maybe it was his apparent vulnerability or the way he listened without judgment. My husband, ex-husband, works at the bank, Robert Hayes. He's prominent in town, connected. When our marriage ended, people chose sides. She managed a small smile. Let's just say I didn't win the popularity contest. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. Robert Hayes, assistant manager at Millfield Community Bank, the man whose financial records had first caught the attention of federal investigators, the man whose photograph was currently hidden in Thomas's jacket pocket, along with evidence of transactions that painted a picture of systematic money laundering. Margaret was married to one of his targets. Had been married, she'd said, but still, the connection sent warning bells ringing in Thomas's mind. Was her presence in his room coincidental or part of a larger plan? But as he watched her face in the soft evening light, seeing the genuine hurt there when she spoke about her failed marriage, Thomas found himself wanting to believe in her innocence. That, he reminded himself, was exactly the kind of thinking that got undercover agents killed. I'm sorry, he said carefully. Divorce is never easy. No, it's not. Margaret stood, smoothing her uniform. I should let you rest. Dr. Harrison will be making rounds soon, and he likes his patients settled for the night. After she left, Thomas lay staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. Dr. Harrison had been another person of interest in his investigation, not directly connected to the financial crimes, but someone who'd appeared in too many photographs, attended too many social functions with the wrong people. In a conspiracy that relied on information and coordination, a hospital administrator would be perfectly positioned to provide cover. The twist came the next morning when Dr. Harrison himself pulled Margaret aside after checking on Thomas's condition. We need to discuss Mr. Blake, the doctor said, his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to the patient rooms. There are some irregularities in his case. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. What kind of irregularities? The police have been asking questions. Detective Murphy thinks there might be more to his story than we realize. Harrison glanced toward room 247, then back to Margaret. I need you to be very careful around him. Document everything he says, especially if he starts remembering details about his past. Doctor, surely you don't think he's dangerous. He has a head injury. Head injuries can be faked, Nurse Hayes, and even if his condition is genuine, we don't know what kind of man he was before the accident. Harrison's expression was grave. I'm not trying to frighten you, but I want you to maintain professional distance. No personal conversations, no time alone with him beyond what's medically necessary. Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Her growing feelings for Thomas, and she had to admit they were feelings, not just professional concern, suddenly seemed foolish, even dangerous. The central choice loomed before her. Should she trust this man who might be lying about everything or protect herself from another potential betrayal? The question haunted her through the following week, even as her feelings for Thomas deepened despite her better judgment. She found herself bringing him coffee during her breaks, their conversations extending far beyond medical care. He seemed to understand her in ways Robert never had, listening when she talked about her dreams of traveling, her frustration with small-town gossip, her fears about her father's declining health. But pressure mounted from multiple directions. Nurse Betty Thornton, the hospital's unofficial source of all gossip, began whispering to other staff about Margaret's unprofessional attachment to the mysterious patient. The whispers followed Margaret through the halls, making her hyper-aware of every moment she spent in room 247. Dr. Harrison's warnings became more frequent and more pointed. Federal agents had been asking questions about Thomas, he told her. His case might involve criminal activity. Margaret needed to remember her professional obligations and her own safety. Meanwhile, Thomas struggled with his growing genuine affection for Margaret. His investigation had revealed that someone in the hospital was feeding information to the criminals he'd been tracking. Someone who knew about patient schedules, security protocols, and financial records. The deeper he dug into the hospital's operations, the more convinced he became that his would-be killers had inside help. But Margaret seemed so genuinely caring, so obviously struggling with her own problems, that Thomas found it hard to believe. She could be part of a criminal conspiracy, unless, a voice in his head warned, that was exactly what they wanted him to think. The emotional blow came on a Tuesday afternoon when Robert Hayes made an unexpected visit to the hospital. Margaret was updating charts at the nurses' station when she looked up to see her ex-husband approaching, his familiar confident stride, unchanged by their divorce. "Hello, Margaret." Robert's voice was pleasant enough, but his eyes were cold. "I heard you've been spending a lot of time with that patient, the one with no memory." "It's my job, Robert." "Is it?" He leaned against the counter, lowering his voice so the other staff couldn't hear. "Because from what I'm told, you're getting pretty personal with someone who might be dangerous." Margaret set down her pen, meeting his gaze steadily. "What do you want?" "I want you to be careful. This town has been good to you, Margaret, despite everything. But people are starting to talk about your attachment to this stranger. If something happens, if he turns out to be someone other than what he claims, it could reflect poorly on the hospital, on you." The implicit threat was clear. In the town, where Robert had connections and influence, Margaret's reputation and job security could disappear overnight. "You're playing with fire, Margaret," Robert said softly. "This town doesn't forget, and it doesn't forgive. Think about your father's medical expenses before you do something you might regret." After he left, Margaret sat in the staff bathroom, hands shaking as the implications of Robert's visit sank in. Her ex-husband rarely did anything without calculating the potential benefit to himself. His warning about Thomas felt less like concern for her welfare and more like a threat. The new complication arrived that same evening in the form of Detective Ray Murphy, a heavy-set man with tired eyes and a rumpled suit. Margaret watched through the doorway as Murphy questioned Thomas with an aggressiveness that seemed unnecessary for someone with a head injury. "Let's go through this again," Murphy was saying. "You remember nothing about the night you were found. No faces, no voices, no reason why someone might want to hurt you." "I've told you everything I can remember," Thomas replied, his voice strained. "I wish I could be more help." "See? That's the thing," Murphy said, leaning back in his chair. "Most people with your kind of injury remember fragments, bits and pieces, but your memory loss is awfully convenient." When Murphy left, he stopped by the nurse's station where Margaret was pretending to be busy with paperwork. "That man isn't who you think he is," the detective said quietly. "For your own safety, I'd keep my distance if I were you." Margaret's world felt like it was tilting sideways. Everyone seemed to know something she didn't. Everyone was warning her away from Thomas. But when she looked at him, really looked at him, she saw only a man who seemed as lost and confused as she felt. That night, she made a decision that would change everything. While organizing Thomas's personal effects for storage, Margaret's fingers found something unusual in the lining of his jacket. A small tear in the fabric revealed a hidden pocket, and inside that pocket, her world shattered A federal badge. Department of Justice, Special Agent Thomas Blake. Beneath the badge were photographs, surveillance shots of people she recognized. Robert at the bank, Dr. Harrison at a restaurant, several other Millfield residents, all taken with a telephoto lens. And at the bottom of the stack, financial documents covered in handwritten notes that made no sense to her, but clearly represented months of investigation. Margaret's hands trembled as she stared at the evidence of Thomas's deception. He wasn't a victim with amnesia. He was a federal agent who'd been investigating her ex-husband, possibly her colleagues, maybe even her. The confrontation came the next morning during shift change, when the corridors were quiet and they could speak without being overheard. "I know who you are," Margaret said without preamble, closing the door to room 247 behind her. Thomas looked up from his breakfast tray, and for the first time since she'd known him, his expression was completely unguarded. No confusion, no hesitation, just the sharp, intelligent gaze of someone who'd been caught in a lie. "I found your badge," Margaret continued, "and the photographs, the documents. How long were you planning to keep lying to me?" Thomas sat down, his coffee cup with deliberate care. "Margaret, I can explain." "Can you? Because right now, it looks like you've been using me to spy on people I know, people I work with, maybe even me." "Not you," Thomas said quickly. "Never you. But yes, I'm investigating financial crimes that involve your ex-husband, and potentially some staff at this hospital. My cover was blown, and someone tried to kill me for it. The Amnesia story was the only way I could stay safe while gathering final evidence." Margaret sank into the bedside chair, her mind reeling. Who's involved?" "I can't tell you that. Not yet. Not until I'm certain who can be trusted." "And you don't trust me?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "I want to trust you, more than I should, considering the circumstances. But Margaret, the person who tried to kill me, had inside information about my investigation. Someone in this hospital is feeding information to criminals. So you thought it might be me?" "Initially, yes. Your connection to Robert Hayes made you a person of interest. But watching you, getting to know you..." Thomas reached out as if to take her hand, then stopped himself. "I know this is hard to believe, but my feelings for you are real. They weren't part of the plan, and they're making everything more complicated." Margaret stood abruptly, pacing to the window. The morning light revealed nothing but ordinary small-town life. People walking to work, children waiting for school, buses, the normal rhythm of a community that apparently harbored dark secrets. "What do you need?" she asked finally. Thomas blinked. "What? If someone in this hospital is helping criminals, and if they already tried to kill you once, then we need to stop them. What do you need from me?" For a brief moment, they were on the same side. Margaret agreed to help Thomas identify the insider, using her access to staff schedules and patient records to look for patterns that might reveal the connection. Together, they discovered that Dr. Harrison had been making unusual requests for patient information, specifically targeting individuals with significant assets or complex financial situations. The pieces fell into place with terrifying clarity. Harrison had access to patient records that revealed when wealthy individuals were incapacitated or hospitalized. He could coordinate with Robert at the bank to identify accounts ripe for manipulation. The hospital's legitimate patient database was being used as a shopping list for financial crimes. "We need evidence," Thomas said, "something that directly connects Harrison to the money laundering operation." Margaret's nursing experience proved invaluable as they planned their next move. She would document Harrison's requests for specific patient files, cross-referencing them with unusual banking activity that Robert had flagged in his own records. Thomas would provide the federal investigation framework to make sense of the financial data. They planned to meet the following evening with evidence that would shut down the entire operation. Margaret felt a surge of hope. Maybe they could expose the truth and find a way to be together. Maybe her feelings for this man weren't based on lies after all. But when Margaret arrived at their agreed meeting place, the old railway bridge, where Thomas had supposedly been found, she discovered that everything had been a trap. Dr. Harrison stepped out of the shadows first, followed by Robert and two men Margaret didn't recognize. The moonlight reflected off something metallic in one of the stranger's hands. "Hello, Margaret," Robert said conversationally. "Thank you for leading us to Mr. Blake's evidence." The betrayal hit her like a physical blow. "I didn't." "Oh, but you did. Every conversation you had with our federal friend, every file you accessed, every move you made. We've been watching it all." Harrison's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing a patient's treatment plan. "Did you really think we wouldn't notice a nurse suddenly taking interest in administrative records?" Thomas appeared from the other side of the bridge, his hands raised but his eyes alert and calculating. "Let her go. Your problem is with me." "Actually, our problem is with both of you now," Robert said. "Margaret's become quite the liability. All those questions she's been asking, all those files she's been copying. We can't have that kind of curiosity going unpunished." Margaret felt the world spinning around her as the full scope of her betrayal became clear. Thomas had never told her the complete truth. He'd been using her access to hospital records, just as she'd feared. But Robert and Harrison had been using her, too, watching her fumbling attempts at investigation to identify exactly what Thomas knew and how much evidence he'd gathered. "You planned this," she whispered. "All of it." "Not all of it," Robert admitted. "Your romantic attachment to Blake was a delightful surprise, made it so much easier to predict your behavior." He smiled, the same smile that had once charmed her into marriage. "Your financial troubles made you a perfect target for recruitment. Margaret, we'd planned to frame you as the insider all along. But then you had to go and fall for our federal friend, and things got complicated." Standing on the bridge where this nightmare had begun, Margaret faced the devastating reality that everyone she'd trusted had betrayed her. Thomas with his lies and manipulation, Robert with his calculated cruelty, Harrison with his abuse of medical authority. She was alone, surrounded by people who saw her as nothing more than a useful tool to be discarded when convenient. But in that moment of absolute darkness, Margaret experienced something she hadn't felt in years: clarity about her own worth. "You're right," she said quietly. "I did copy files. I did ask questions. I did investigate." Harrison looked satisfied. "Then you understand why—" "But what you don't understand," Margaret interrupted, "is that I'm not the same woman who let Robert manipulate her into a marriage, or who let this hospital administration take advantage of her loyalty." She looked directly at Thomas. "And I'm not naive enough to trust a federal agent who's been lying to me from the moment we met." Robert frowned. "Margaret, what are you—" "I'm saying that while I was busy falling for Thomas's act, I was also doing something none of you expected." Margaret reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her cell phone. "I was thinking like a nurse, and nurses document everything." The screen showed an active call, a call that had been connected for the past 10 minutes. "The state police have been listening to this entire conversation," Margaret said, "including Robert's confession to framing me, Harrison's admission to providing patient information to criminals, and your plans to eliminate Thomas and me." The sound of sirens began to echo across the valley, growing closer with each passing second. Harrison stepped toward her, his face twisted with rage. "You little—" "I wouldn't," Thomas said, his voice carrying authority that hadn't been there during his Amnesia act. Federal agents tend to take threats against civilians very seriously. As police cars surrounded the bridge, their red and blue lights painting the scene in stark colors, Margaret felt Thomas take her hand. For the first time since she'd known him, the gesture felt completely honest. "How did you know?" he asked quietly, as Harrison and Robert were placed in handcuffs. I didn't, not completely. But this afternoon, when you told me we were meeting here, I realized something. A man with real amnesia wouldn't remember the specific location where he was found, especially not well enough to suggest it as a meeting. A place. Margaret managed a small smile. Plus, Robert's threat about my father's medical expenses was a little too convenient. He's been healthy as a horse for the past 3 years. Thomas looked at her with something approaching admiration. You've been testing me. I've been protecting myself, something I should have learned to do a long time ago. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the same hospital room where she'd first met Thomas Blake, or rather where she'd first met the man pretending to be Thomas Blake. The real Thomas, she'd learned, was indeed a federal investigator, but his actual personality was quite different from the vulnerable patient she'd fallen for. The investigation had uncovered a network of financial crimes that stretched far beyond Millfield, with tentacles reaching into 3 states and involving millions of dollars in laundered money. Robert and Harrison were facing federal charges that would likely result in decades in prison. The hospital had undergone a complete administrative overhaul, and Margaret had been promoted to head nurse with a substantial raise in recognition of her role in exposing the corruption. She was training a new nurse, a young woman fresh out of school, who reminded Margaret of herself at that age, eager to help and perhaps too trusting of the people around her. The key to patient care, Margaret was explaining, is documentation. Document everything, question inconsistencies, and never assume that things are what they appear to be. A soft knock on the door interrupted her lesson. Thomas Blake stood in the doorway, no longer wearing a hospital gown, but dressed in a well-tailored suit that spoke of successful career and government salary. His dark hair was neatly styled, his posture confident, and his smile carried none of the hesitant vulnerability that had first attracted her. "Agent Blake," Margaret said formally, "what brings you back to Millfield?" "I'm transferring to the regional office," Thomas said. "Thought you might like to know that the investigation you helped with has resulted in the arrest of 37 people across multiple states. Your documentation of Harrison's activities was crucial to several prosecutions." Margaret nodded, pleased but not surprised. She'd always been thorough in her work. "I was wondering," Thomas continued, "if you might have dinner with me sometime. As ourselves this time, no cover stories or hidden agendas." Margaret considered the offer, studying his face. The man standing before her was intelligent, successful, and undoubtedly brave. He was also someone who'd lied to her for weeks, manipulated her emotions, and put her life in danger for the sake of his investigation. But she was no longer the woman who'd been married to Robert Hayes, no longer someone who could be easily deceived or manipulated. She'd learned to trust her own judgment, to document everything, to question appearances. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Thomas smiled, and for just a moment she caught a glimpse of the vulnerable man she'd thought she'd fallen in love with. Maybe that man had been real after all, hidden beneath the professional exterior. Maybe they could build something honest on the foundation of all the lies they'd told each other, or maybe not. Margaret was no longer in a hurry to find out. The morning light streamed through the same Venetian blinds that had illuminated their first meeting, but now it revealed something entirely different. A woman who knew her own worth, a man who understood the cost of deception and the possibility that truth, even delayed and complicated truth, might be worth the wait. Margaret Hayes had learned to document everything, to question assumptions, and to trust her instincts. If Thomas Blake wanted a chance at something real, he would have to earn it the same way she had, through honesty, patience, and the willingness to be vulnerable without pretense. The story that had begun with lies might yet end with truth, but this time Margaret would be writing her own ending. Thank you for listening to this story until the end. If you enjoyed it, please support the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments so you don't miss the next episodes. See you in the next story.